Hello and welcome back to the Wellbe podcast, a weekly series designed to help you learn, expand what you thought was possible, and become as empowered as you can possibly be in your health. I'm your host, Nolan-Smith, a board-certified holistic patient advocate and the founder of Wellbe. And today I'm bringing you a brand new episode all about releasing trauma and suppressed emotions, and the connection, of course, between trauma and chronic disease. Before we jump in, I want to give a shout out to Qigong Dana, or as she is known, who wrote in a review of the podcast about a specific episode I did a few weeks ago on the science behind prayer and spirituality. She wrote, "Thank you, Adrian, for tackling this much-needed discussion of the complex and often dismissed topic of prayer or spiritual-based practice on health and healing. Thank you also for sharing your personal experience. It's great to know what kind of science is out there, as well as the limitations of the modern scientific methodology to adequately prove or disprove this practice that has existed since the dawn of humanity." Thank you, Qigong Dana. I agree, that episode was one of my favorites of season 6, both the experience of researching for the episode and the personal spiritual growth that happened during an intense experience I had in June that I shared in the episode. I'm so touched by your kind words. If you're listening, please email hello@getwellbe.com and my team is going to send you a special gift in gratitude for leaving a review of the podcast and for such sweet words. If you want a shout out from me or a chance to win a gift from Wellbe, make sure you leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. You don't even have to stop listening to this episode. Just scroll all the way down on our podcast page in your app and click Write a Review. Then give us a few stars and a few words, and then press Submit in the top right-hand corner. It's super fast and easy, but actually very important for any podcast, so thank you for doing it now. All right, now, most of us probably don't think of ourselves as someone who has lived through trauma, like abuse, abandonment, or some kind of tragic accident. Yet the more we learn about the concept of trauma, the more scientists are beginning to understand that in early childhood, much more subtle events can cause trauma and affect your long-term chronic disease risk, as well as your ability to heal symptoms in the short term. The craziest part is that we don't even know about most of these traumas that have such a huge impact on our lives, or they're buried so deep that our conscious minds can't see how much they affect us. Thankfully, there are ways to pull them to the surface, as painful or uncomfortable as that may be, and then release them. So today I'm going to share what I've learned about how repressed feelings affect your health, proven techniques for releasing emotions, how to heal emotional trauma through EMDR, trauma therapy, which I'll talk a lot more about, and many other kinds of therapy as well. Before we go any further, I do want to share that my inspiration for this episode came in January, actually, a while ago, when I first learned that I was pregnant with my son, who is now less than 2 weeks away from his due date, or depending on when you listen to this, might already be in the world. I decided that I wanted to look into trauma release and ways that I could get rid of some probably buried traumas and emotions that had to do with things in my childhood and my 20s, including my mother's suicide, my parents' divorce, and a couple of other things. So, like I just said, trauma doesn't always have to be surviving a murder attempt or physical abuse. It can be a lot of different things, and we'll talk a lot more about that in this episode. But I decided to look into the different therapeutic modalities for getting these traumas out of the body that you may not even know are there. So I'm going to go through all of them, but just know that it came from a desire to do this personally and to avoid passing along traumas and negative emotions that were buried deep inside me to the next generation, and hoping that I could release them and provide a less traumatic experience for my son as he came into the world. All right, so back to the research. Before we get too far into the health repercussions, it's important to first define repressed feelings. Repressed feelings, which are sometimes referred to as trapped emotions or emotional blockages, are emotions that you unconsciously avoid. Someone might have repressed feelings for a number of different reasons, but it often has to do with the way they were taught to handle tough emotions when they were children. If a child is taught that it's not okay to show negative feelings like anger, sadness, or fear, then they become conditioned to hide these emotions, even from themselves. They never learn to process and understand hard emotions, and so they view them all as too overwhelming and scary to even acknowledge. Repressed emotions can also be the result of unprocessed trauma. Trauma refers to any extraordinarily distressful event, be it physical, emotional, or psychological. It's defined by the intensity of the negative emotions it causes, not an objective assessment of a specific occurrence. And so it can encompass a wide range of different triggering events. Some examples of trauma include a serious accident or injury, a violent attack, childhood neglect, abuse, illness, the sudden death of a loved one, miscarriage, as well as many more examples that we may not think of as traditional trauma, such as a parent's divorce or finding out your parent was having an affair, and many, many other things. Trauma causes intense emotions that need to be processed shortly after the traumatic event. When these emotions aren't processed, they stay in our unconscious mind as repressed feelings. Note that repressed emotions are different from suppressed emotions, which are emotions that you actively decide to push down. You have to be conscious of them in order to actively decide to push them down. For example, if your sister is triggering anger during a family get-together, you might choose to suppress that emotion and deal with it at a more appropriate time. Repressed feelings, on the other hand, never get dealt with because your conscious mind isn't aware that they're there anymore. But that doesn't mean they go away. Rather, because they're never processed, they remain in your mind and body and can make themselves known and wreak havoc in a number of different indirect ways. If you're familiar with the strength of the mind-body connection, and if you're not, be sure to read or watch or listen to my interview with Heal documentary filmmaker Kelly Noonan-Gores, who was also the co-creator of the Roadmap to Healing program, one of my online programs that gives you a roadmap to healing any sort of chronic health issue. But back to the topic at mind. Then it should come as no surprise that repressed feelings and unprocessed trauma can have a major impact on your health. Some of the ways that might manifest include: Number 1, decreased immune function. Repressed negative emotions have been shown to negatively affect the immune system, leading to more frequent infections and slower recovery from illness. Number 2, anxiety and depression. Trapped emotions can be a root cause of anxiety and depressive disorders. These mental health conditions also come with their own physical side effects, including muscle tension, digestive problems, insomnia, and more. Number 3, we have chronic illness. Childhood trauma has been shown to increase the likelihood that someone will have chronic health issues as an adult. It's been linked to many of the leading causes of death in the U.S. for adults, including heart disease, cancer, lung disease, and liver disease, as well as autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis. Number 4, we have migraines. Though the exact connection between the two is unclear, it's thought that the muscle tension brought about by the stress of repressing emotions could be a contributing cause to migraines. Number 5, amenorrhea, which is the loss of a woman's menstrual cycle. A woman's menstrual cycle is intimately connected to her physical and psychological health, and the psychological burden of repressed feelings can lead to the loss of her period. Number 6, we have cardiovascular disease. Trapped anger specifically has been tied to heart issues like hypertension and cardiovascular disease. And lastly, number 7 is substance abuse. Drugs and alcohol can offer a quick way to numb emotions and keep difficult feelings at bay, leading to addiction and abuse for some people. Pushing away hard emotions isn't something to be ashamed of. It can be a mode of survival, serving an important purpose during a difficult time. However, repressed feelings and unprocessed trauma can't be ignored forever without them taking a toll on your mind, body, and relationships. Thankfully, emotional healing is completely possible with a bit of commitment and work. Most of us are familiar with processing and releasing emotions in the moment or shortly thereafter. When something happens that makes you upset, you likely spend some time working it out in your mind, you journal about it, perhaps you talk it through with a loved one or a therapist, or something else like that. But when we're talking about releasing emotions or trauma that has been repressed for a long time and you likely don't even realize it's being repressed or that it's affecting you, the situation is different. These feelings are often completely inaccessible without some structured professional support. The good news is that this support exists and that there are, in fact, numerous different approaches to this kind of emotional healing. Number 1, naming and processing emotions. It sounds simple, but this is the most broad of the emotional release strategies. but it's also incredibly powerful. Depending on where you look, you'll find slightly different specific step-by-step instructions for this technique, but the general process and goal remains the same. Essentially, you want to identify and name aloud the emotions you're having, as well as where in the body you feel it. For example, I feel anger and it's a tightness in my chest, or more specifically in my diaphragm. Then you release the emotion using breath work, imagery, affirmations, or another technique. Deepak Chopra's step-by-step guide is a good framework for getting started, though it's highly recommended that you do this with a trained professional rather than alone. Number 2 is movement and exercise. Trauma and blocked emotions can throw off your body's natural rhythm as well as overly activate your sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight system, at the expense of your parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and repair system. Regular movement and exercise can help to reset your body and has been shown to be an effective intervention for post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD. Number 3 is meditation and mindfulness. Mindfulness and meditation techniques are another effective tool for calming down the sympathetic nervous system and quieting the chatter of the mind as well as overactivity of the body. Because emotional trauma and repressed emotions are stored in the body, having moments where the mind is quiet and you can fully inhabit your physical self can be very helpful for accessing deeply repressed feelings. Research has also shown that meditation increases feelings of well-being and improves emotional regulation, both of which can make it easier for a person to process difficult emotions. Number 4 is chiropractic treatment, if you can believe it or not. Chiropractic therapy involves stimulating and loosening areas in the body that have become tightened, stiffened, or locked up. This can be helpful for releasing trapped emotions in a number of ways. First, it simply helps to open up and release fascia and muscles where these repressed feelings may be stored. Secondly, because chiropractic works on the spinal cord, it directly affects the activity of the brain. Trauma can rewire the way our brain responds to stress, and so chiropractic treatment has the potential to undo this rewiring and restore healthy stress response. In fact, some researchers define PTSD as a brain injury rather than a psychiatric disorder, making chiropractic treatments an even more logical approach. Number 6, we have craniosacral therapy. We have a great episode with the former head of Aetna about his dramatic injury and recovery using craniosacral therapy. So search Mark Bertolini and getwellbe in your podcast app if you're interested in listening to that episode. It's fantastic. Craniosacral therapy is a therapeutic approach that involves light touch from the cranium, the brain, down to your sacrum, your tailbone, and back up again, with the goal of removing toxins, bringing nutrients to the brain, and promoting well-being. Research has shown that it can get your body into a parasympathetic state and help people process trauma. Lastly, we have emotional freedom technique, or EFT, which is also known as tapping, which can be particularly helpful for releasing emotions that have been buried deep down for a long time. It involves using gentle acupressure tapping motions along the main meridians or energy pathways of the body, while also talking about and processing emotions out loud at the same time. The tapping motions are meant to disrupt your body's stress response with calming signals, allowing the body and mind to release trauma and trapped feelings. You can learn more about EFT and tapping with our interview with Jessica Ortner. So again, you can search Jessica Ortner and getwellbe in your podcast app for that episode, or you can read the article or watch the video on getwellbe.com. Another powerful emotional healing tool that you may have heard of is EMDR trauma therapy. It's a huge topic and hugely effective, and it's the one that I used over the last several months, so I'm going to talk more about it in depth now. EMDR stands for Eye Movement Desensitization and Reprocessing, and it's an interactive therapy technique used to treat PTSD and help people process trauma. As the name suggests, EMDR trauma therapy involves guided eye movements, which are coupled with reliving a traumatic or triggering event for short intervals of time. The theory behind this technique is that the eye movements divert your attention, making it less upsetting to recall traumatic events so that you can work through them without a major stress response. Over time, EMDR trauma therapy is meant to lessen the impact of a traumatic event so that eventually you can recall it on your own without re-experiencing the trauma. There's strong evidence to suggest that this approach works. In terms of treating PTSD, One study found that EMDR trauma therapy helped 77% of people with PTSD or a psychotic disorder lessen their symptoms significantly, while another showed EMDR to be a more effective approach than exposure therapy, which is helping a person overcome fear or trauma by exposing them to the source of their fear or trauma. Exposure therapy has long been used as a go-to trauma treatment, but EMDR therapy has also proved effective against depression, with one study finding that 68% of depressed patients who underwent EMDR therapy showed full remission after treatment. While the general theory behind EMDR is relatively simple, the practice itself is a bit more complicated. EMDR trauma therapy is an 8-phase treatment, with the phases continuing from session to session and repeating one cycle has been completed. The 8 phases are: Number 1, history-taking session. In this phase, the therapist will review the patient's history, assess their readiness, and develop a treatment plan. The patient and therapist will also discuss specific targets for EMDR processing, which could be past traumatic events, current distressing situations, difficult emotions, or other related challenges. Number 2 is emotional preparation. In this phase, the therapist makes sure that the patient has coping mechanisms to use if they experience emotional or psychological distress during treatment. These could be techniques such as deep breathing or visualization. Phase 3 through 6 are treatment phases. The therapist works through different targets with the patient, and each of these phases is identical in sequence. The patient focuses on a negative thought, memory, or image, while the therapist instructs them to perform specific eye movements. The therapist may also instruct them to do tapping or other movements mixed in. Afterward, the patient lets their mind go blank and notices any spontaneous thoughts or feelings they are having. At this point, the therapist will decide whether to process the same emotional target again or to move on. Phase 7 is log keeping. The 7th phase occurs between therapy sessions, with the patient keeping a log throughout the week. In the log, they document any relevant emotions or situations that arise and make an effort to use their coping skills if distressing or traumatic emotions arise. And then phase 8 is evaluation. This phase begins the subsequent session, and it involves evaluating the progress made so far, including anything that came up throughout the week and any concerns about things coming up in the future. From here, the therapist and patient go back to phase 2 again, either identifying new targets to process or revisiting targets from a previous session. There isn't a finite length of time that a person will need to undergo EMDR trauma therapy. Rather, patients and their therapists keep an open dialogue about how progress is going and mutually decide when they've adequately processed their feelings and are ready to stop EMDR therapy. In my experience, this was more or less how it went. I started working with an EMDR certified therapist over Zoom back in February of 2021 with weekly sessions. And I have to admit, the first couple of sessions, I wasn't sure if we were really going to accomplish any sort of big release because it felt somewhat like traditional talk therapy. But once we actually got into the EMDR work, we used a software that had a little ball that moved across the screen so that my eyes would follow it as we accessed different emotions, experiences, and usually tried to tie them to some kind of image. Then I would take a moment and express to the therapist anything that came up associated with it. Oftentimes I felt like I was doing it wrong, or my eyes couldn't follow the little ball, or I was distracted, or nothing was really coming up, which if you have done EMDR therapy or do it in the future, you'll probably feel like you're doing it wrong as well. But as my therapist reminded me over and over, there's no right or wrong way to do it. You just follow the ball and try to keep whatever the agreed upon images in your mind that is related to some sort of suppressed or difficult emotion or experience. I have to say I had a handful of big releases. And by big releases, I mean sort of explosive crying the way you might as a small child where you can hardly breathe. So much crying and so much pain. And you might think, why would you do this yourself? But I have to say, I felt a release in a way that I don't think I could have ever gotten to through talk therapy. And really, it showed me that I had suppressed emotions and traumas that I had no idea were still affecting me. And things that I thought would probably still be affecting me weren't the things coming up that were very triggering. They were, perhaps earlier in life than the things that I would assume would be triggering, or things that I just had no idea were hurtful or painful or suppressed and still affecting me. So I do recommend the treatment. It definitely helped me to identify things that were stuck and therefore still affecting me and my life and my behaviors and my thought patterns and, could in the future lead to many of the different chronic symptoms and diseases that I explained before. And yes, parts of it were painful and emotionally exhausting, but I would so much rather accelerate that process and get rid of things than have them carried around in me for a long time. So I can definitely say it was helpful. And certainly those first few sessions where I felt like, is this actually going to do something? This sort of feels like talk therapy, were part of the process that I've seen through my research to be normal in EMDR work before getting into any sessions with the actual eye movement and reprocessing of these emotions and traumas. All right, so in summary, trapped emotions, whether they come from repressed feelings or unprocessed trauma, are serious things that need to be dealt with. However, many people never take on the task because it feels overwhelming, and as I said, it's painful. But with a bit of knowledge about different techniques for releasing emotions, it's possible for everyone to let go of their trapped feelings and find emotional healing. Here's what to know. Repressed emotions or trapped emotions or emotional blockages are emotions that are unconsciously buried and never dealt with. People could have repressed feelings because of the way they were taught to handle emotions as children, or the repressed feelings could come from unprocessed trauma. These differ from suppressed emotions, which are feelings that we actively push away and eventually deal with at a later time. Both repressed feelings and unprocessed trauma can have a negative impact on your physical health. They've been associated with decreased immune function, anxiety and depression, chronic illness, migraines, amenorrhea, cardiovascular disease, and substance abuse. They can also impact your body's ability to heal chronic symptoms or diseases. Some of you may know that I had an experience with amenorrhea for several years in college and with mild Hashimoto's. So to say that these unprocessed traumas and stuck emotions could have led to some of the chronic health issues that I experienced is not far off. I believe other things were at play, but they certainly could have played a role. Next, there are a number of different approaches for processing trauma and releasing trapped emotions. Some of the most popular include physical exercise, meditation and mindfulness, chiropractic treatment, craniosacral therapy, and EFT, which is emotional freedom technique, also known as tapping, and then, of course, EMDR, which is the eye movement desensitization and reprocessing that I used this past year with a therapist. EMDR is shown to be particularly effective at helping heal symptoms of PTSD as well as depression. It involves working with a therapist, as I mentioned, to revisit traumatic memories or difficult feelings while the therapist instructs the patient to make specific eye movements and then talk about anything that came up as far as images and thoughts, etc. Well, thanks everyone for listening. Now, if it's helpful for you to share your experience with releasing trauma or repressed emotions, absolutely no pressure. But if you would like to, head over to the article version of this episode on getwellbe.com and leave a comment, and you'll find a link to that article in the show notes. Also, while you're there, become a Wellbe Insider so that you can get all of our latest content, special offers, and personal notes I don't share anywhere else weekly in your inbox. Plus, you'll get a free copy of my audio guide on how to feel the best you've ever felt and heal anything. The 10 things you need to optimize your health and heal any health issue, big or small, naturally. Even if you're the healthiest person out there, I promise you'll learn something you didn't know before that can help you to optimize your health. Today's episode of the Wellbe podcast is actually the last of season 6, given that my due date, as I mentioned, with my first child is in less than 2 weeks. Or if you're listening to this episode later, it's possible I've already delivered my son, which is crazy to think about. We're going to be taking a bit of a longer break between season 6 and 7 than we normally would given his arrival, but don't forget that we have published over 132 episodes of the Wellbe podcast, so definitely go back to some that you haven't heard, and I promise you some will blow your mind. I'll be popping in with a few update episodes over the next few weeks and months, so if you haven't already, subscribe to the podcast. This way you'll get a notification in your podcast app when we publish a new episode. Oh, and please share this episode with family or friends who you think might find it valuable and informative. It means a lot and helps more people find the podcast. If you already have, then thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Once again, this is your host, Adrienne Nolan-Smith, and thank you for allowing me into your car, your home, on your morning walks, or wherever you listen to episodes. It is such an honor, and I can't wait to come back with season 7 and some fantastic new experts and topics to help you, as always, be the CEO of your health and have the tools you need to be successful in that role. Last but not least, thank you for leaving a review of the Wellbe podcast. Each one is so touching to me, and they are so appreciated and helpful for the Wellbe podcast to grow. I'll be back soon with lots of exciting news and learnings about this wild adventure I'm embarking on. In the meantime, I'm sending lots of love and a big hug.